Hello, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 19, Evolution of Plants. So let's get started. We're going to be going over the basic introductory traits of these guys and their land adaptations. We're going to look into their reproductive cycle. Then we're going to go talk about their evolutionary history, non-vascular plants versus vascular plants, seedless plants versus seeded plants. Then we're going to get a little bit more specific with the seeded plants. And then we're going to kind of just a little overview at the end. So make sure you look at the handout that I've attached in Canvas to help you stay organized as we're going through this chapter. Plants are in domain Eukarya, and they are in kingdom Plantae. Now you need to know these basic characteristics. They are, of course, eukaryotic, since they are in domain Eukarya. They are multicellular, and they are also non-modal. They do not move. Plants are photosynthetic autotrophs. That means they create their own food via the process of photosynthesis. And plants have cellulose, which makes up their cell wall composition. Now, what their sexual life cycle is called is alteration of generation. And we're going to go into detail about that here in a little while. You also need to know that plants are pretty much terrestrial. There are some that are aquatic, but mostly they live on land. They also have well-developed tissues. They also protect their embryo from drying out within the female structure. They also contain chlorophylls A and B and carotenoid pigments inside these organelles called chloroplasts. And they also store their food as starch. Now the little asterisks, so chlorophyll B and the starch, are thought to have evolved from green algae, which we know is a protist. And so as time has gone on, certain traits have still stayed within these plants. Let's talk about the advantages for plants being on land. First of all, the closer you are to the sun, the easier it's going to be accessed the sunlight for them to have photosynthesis. You will also have an increase of CO2 on land because of the ability for the gas to flow. And so both of these, the sunlight and CO2, are required for photosynthesis. So how they get their nutrition is easier on land than when they are in the water. Now, some disadvantages for plants being on land is that they aren't surrounded by water, which is needed for them to survive. And so they have an increased water loss, especially as you get to the desert. They also have increased gravitational pull that they have to overcome to get the water from the roots all the way up into their leaves. And so that is also a disadvantage of being on land. Plant adaptations for terrestrial lifestyle. Alright, so plants have certain types of tissues and various structures that have helped them to be able to stay on land without drying out and to help them overcome gravity. So the first thing that they have is vascular tissue. This provides support and helps overcome gravitational pull. Now, not all plants have vascular tissue, but those that do are able to grow tall. Plants have a waxy cuticle. This decreases water loss, and we don't find it in the roots. That's because the roots aren't exposed to wind and the sunlight, and so you're going to not have as much water loss down underground versus above the soil. And plants also have what's called a stomata. These are found on the leaves. And they're mostly congregated on the bottom of the leaves, but you can find them on both top and bottom. But these can open and close, and this helps decrease water loss. So looking at this image here, we see that this orangey layer right here is the cuticle on leaves and then the bottom. And then you have their different layers of mesophyll, which we'll talk about here in a little while, and the vascular tissue, which is going to be the xylem and phloem. And then you have down here these holes, the stomata. Stoma literally means mouth. And so we have these what's called guard cells that help open and close depending on how hot or how much water is being evaporated. And the plant can control that opening, so making sure that the plant doesn't lose more water than necessary. Here are some terms that we're going to be using for the rest of the semester, so please make sure you know these terms. We're going to be using them in plants, and some of these are also going to be used for animals, and it's just going to be really important for you to know the definitions. Okay, so the first one, diploid. Di means two, and so this denotes a full set of chromosomes. And we write it out just with 2 lowercase n, so 2n. Haploid is, you think of it as half. It denotes half the number of chromosomes. So we write that with just an n. You could put 1n, but it's the same thing. So 2n is diploid, n is haploid. Gametes. Gametes are sex cells. We also denote them by an n, okay? And so, for example, sex cells would be sperm and ova or egg. The zygote, which we talked a little bit about zygote being yolk, is the first structure formed after fertilization. So when you have 1/2, so an n, from one gamete, so the sperm, and you have an n of a female, an ova, or an egg, when they come together, now you have 2n. You have the full set of chromosomes, making a complete individual called a zygote. And so zygote is 2n. Now you have this process called meiosis. Meiosis produces the spores and reduces the number of chromosomes by half. So it takes 2n and makes n. So this is what's saying it's an individual that has a full set of chromosomes that creates sex cells. So it takes the normal full individual, divides it into sperm or egg, which are half the number of chromosomes. Fertilization is the process that restores the number of chromosomes. Like we talked about, you have a sperm, an egg, so n plus n comes together and fuses and makes 2n. So meiosis and fertilization are opposites of each other. Meiosis breaks that apart. Fertilization brings them back together to have the full number of chromosomes. Okay. Now mitosis is also another process with cell division, and this takes the gametophytes, which we'll talk about in a moment. They use this to produce gametes, and that the zygote matures into a sporophyte generation. So this is specific to plants. That the process that gametophytes use to produce gametes, and that the zygote matures into the sporophyte generation. Mitosis is just cells creating new cells. Okay, and so, but for plants, we're going to be talking about that sporophyte and gametophyte generation. Sporophyte is a generation that produces spores. Okay, so plants have that alteration generations. They have 2 bodies essentially. The sporophyte creates the spores, which is diploid. The gametophyte produces gametes, which are haploid. Okay, so plants have essentially two alterations, 2 bodies, 2 generations, and those make spores or sex cells or gametes. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of make this more clear for you. So looking at this diagram here, the very top you have the sporophyte generation. And it doesn't matter if it's the top or the bottom when you construct these. It's cyclical. Okay, it's the chicken or the egg, which happened first. And so for now we're going to say the sporophyte generation is going to be on the top. The gametophyte generation is on the bottom. Sporophyte is diploid, gametophyte is haploid. Okay, so we're going to start with fertilization. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Fertilization, so it's the zygote, when you get the 2 sex cells forming to create that zygote, the full diploid individual. That zygote will mature under mitosis, so it's creating more cells. It's just making more cells of itself. When it is an adult, it becomes the sporophyte generation, which is still diploid. Now, the sporophyte generation will form what's called a sporangium, and this is the little structure that produces spores via meiosis. So once you have the sporangium, and inside of it, you're going to have meiosis going under process, and spores will be formed. Now, we talked about this individual had a complete set, the sporophyte generation, and it had a process called meiosis to split those up so they can have separate spores. Now those spores are going to get a little bit bigger, they're going to grow under mitosis, so just making more cells, getting it bigger, and that will become the gametophyte generation, which is still haploid. Now the haploid generation will now produce gametes. Okay, now gametes are still haploid, right? And as we know, when you put N, and then you have a female egg and a male sperm, when they come together, that's called fertilization, and that creates a zygote, which is diploid. So this is kind of different than anything that we have probably ever heard of before. We obviously don't have to worry about this gametophyte generation. We just go straight from meiosis to gametes. And so we have the diploid sexual life cycle. Plants have the alteration of generation sexual life cycle. All right. This chart can also be found in your lab manual, but I find that it's very helpful as we're learning the evolutionary history of plants. So as we know that all plants, they have some common ancestor, and we believe that it was some type of algae, the ancestor, because we talked about earlier the certain chlorophylls and the starch which are found in green algae. And so in your textbook, in your lab manual, it talks a lot about these charophytes. Now, charophytes technically are a sister clade to Kingdom Plantae. They are actually a type of algae, so they're not quite really a plant yet. So that's why if you look on our chart here, they're not connected to any of these other lines here of lines of descent. Because once you have embryo protection, then you're able to have plants, okay? And so these traits right here, you have embryo protection, apical growth, which is at the top, growing up from the end, vascular tissue, which is xylem and phloem, microphylls, which are tiny leaves, to megaphylls, which are big leaves. Then you have seeds, and you eventually get fruit. So that's the evolutionary process of plants throughout time. Now, some of these plants exist today, and they don't have those traits. Just kind of like, if you remember back in chapter 16, how we did, I don't know if you remember how we laid out how many animals had lungs, or how many animals had, no tail, and that kind of thing, that chart that we did, the phylogenetic tree and the cladistics, if you remember. Anyway, and so here, we're going to look on this side right here. Now you have two kind of major sections. You have non-vascular plants and vascular plants. The non-vascular plants are called bryophytes. These include liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Now the vascular plants are those that have the xylem and phloem. We have the lycophytes, the ferns, and allies, other ones that are similar. You also have gymnosperms and flowering plants. So all those have vascular tissue. Now you can break this group even further to seedless plants, to seeded plants. Seedless plants just have spores. Seeded plants actually have seeds that they use to reproduce. So refer to this chart as we're going through the evolutionary history of plants, and this will help you kind of stay organized. So let's first talk about non-vascular plants, specifically the bryophytes. Like we said, it's the hornworts, liverworts, and mosses. So this is called phylum Bryophyta, the ones that we're going to be focusing on. Now, what's interesting about these guys is the gametophyte generation, okay, we know, produces gametes, and the sporophyte generation produces the spores. Now, in every other plant besides the bryophytes, the gametophyte generation is not dominant, I guess. The sporophyte generation is dominant. But in this case, the gametophyte generation, so the one that is haploid, is actually the dominant generation. So when you look at mosses, for example, and bryophytes and liverworts, what you're looking at is actually only half of the chromosomes. So they are haploid. And then they grow little parts that come out of the top. Just the females have it. We'll show you why. Those are the sporophytes. So the sporophyte generation is nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte generation in bryophytes. Pretty crazy. So this chart here is showing us which generation is going to be dominant. So looking at mosses, the brown has most of the picture versus the blue. So it's saying in this picture that the gametophyte generation is more dominant than the sporophyte generation. At ferns, it's almost half, but technically it has more blue. So really it's just the mosses are the only ones that the dominant generation will be the gametophyte. Ferns, gymnosperms, angiosperms, all their generations, the dominant generation will be the sporophyte. Now if you look here, it shows, it's kind of Compared in size, the fern gametophyte generation is much larger than the gymnosperm and angiosperm, but it's still small. It's probably like that big. I don't know if it's like 4 millimeters or something like that. So it's still really small, but compared to the microscopic images of the gymnosperm and the angiosperm gametophyte generation, it's more. So just remember from this picture, the dominant generation in moss is gametophytes. The dominant generation in every other plant will be the sporophyte generation. So the male gametophyte is a flagellated sperm in the bryophytes, and they are formed in the antheridia. Now from the antheridia, these sperm must swim to the female structure, which is called the archegonia, and that's where the ova are created. And so because the sperm physically has to swim in order to fertilize, we can say that the bryophytes are water dependent for the fertilization process. Water must be present in order for fertilization to occur. The zygote is therefore going to be protected in the archegonia, that female structure where the egg is formed and created, and that prevents it from drying out. So that's pretty neat about bryophytes. Now, bryophytes lack vascular tissue, and so they don't really have any true roots or true stems or true leaves. And bryophytes are very low to the ground because they don't have the ability to grow up tall, because they can't defy gravity. And also they don't get very big because they don't have true ways to transport their nutrition very easily. And so they stay low to the ground, which is indicative that they don't have vascular tissue. They do have leaf-like body, okay, and that's covered with a waxy cuticle that also prevents them from losing water. The gametophyte, okay, that's the leafy carpet green stuff of moss and bryophytes, absorbs the nutrients and is anchored with root-like structures. Like we said, they don't have that vascular tissue and they're missing a lot of other things, and so it's just similar, but it's not quite a root. Now, the sporophyte generation, like we said, is considered to be nutritionally dependent. You could say parasitic, but if they don't have it, they're obviously not going to reproduce. And so it grows from the archegonia. And so once that forms out, all of its nutrition it needs actually comes from the gametophyte. Let me show you back to this picture here. If you look, here is the female gametophyte, the green leafy stuff. And then what comes out of here is the sporophyte. So it's just a stalk with the sporangium in the very top. So that requires the gametophyte to live. And so it's not a separate generation like in all the other plants. And so that sporophyte will produce the sporangium, and inside those spores will be formed, and that will bust open, and then the spores will be able to flow out by the wind. And that's how they disperse their species in the bryophytes. So looking at their life cycle here, well first, here's just some images of the antheridia, right here where the sperm is being produced. Call it a leaf, it's not a true leaf. And down here's the archegonia, this is where the eggs are being reproduced and housed. And so this is where the sperm will come by the water, will swim over into here, fertilize that egg, and then it will grow into the sporophyte generation. So looking here, like we said, here's the spores. In this situation, this is the gametophyte and the female and the male gametophyte. And so these are haploid. Down here, it's going to show the sporophyte. So this is the diploid generation. So it doesn't it doesn't matter which is on top or bottom, just as long as you know which generation we're talking about. So this is just a way for you to see how water is required. From, like I said, a raindrop. You find moss by where it's moist, where it rains, by the rivers or streams. That's where you find moss. And so that's how they're able to reproduce. So why are non-vascular plants considered dependent on water, moist environments? You should know this. Because they have flagellated sperm. That sperm can't get anywhere unless it swims. Why does their vegetation remain low-lying? Well, since they don't have vascular tissue, they have to be able to be close enough to be able to absorb those nutrients. And then they have to be able to transport them easily, so they have to stay close to the ground. So they have the capacity to absorb large amounts of water, okay, because they are low, and so they can still do all the functions that plants need to do. Now, the economic importance. Peat moss. So here are some examples here. It's used for gardening. It's used for fuel. You can go to a little bog and you dig it out and you throw that into the fireplace and have heat. Now, just so you guys are aware, we call mosses of plants that aren't really mosses. So, for example, you have this Irish moss, which is actually red algae, and right here, this is reindeer moss. It's a lichen, which we talked about. It's a form of a fungus, even. Then we have club mosses, which actually contains vascular tissue, so it can't be a moss. And then the Spanish moss, which you find in the trees down in the south. That's actually an angiosperm, so it's well evolved compared to bryophytes. So just be aware what you're looking at. Not everything we call a moss is a moss. On to vascular plants. Vascular plants are also called tracheophytes, kind of like trachea, because they actually have vascular tissue that gives them that support. Kind of like your own throat. You feel here, that's your trachea, and it has those ridges and kind of that support there. And so that's where it got its name from. Now, vascular plants, or tracheophytes, are the most diverse and widely distributed of any of the plants. Their dominant generation is the sporophyte generation. Like I said before, they possess xylem and phloem, which is the vascular tissue. And there's this phrase called xylem up, phloem down. So that'll be on the next slide. We'll talk about that in a minute, about how water and nutrients and such are moving inside the plant. The sporophyte generation of vascular plants also possess true roots, leaves, and stems, and they produce the spores, or the homospores, in ferns. So the homospore meaning the same kind of spores, same, identical, and so forth. The gametophyte generation is avascular, so it does not have vascular tissue. It's reduced, so it's not as big. It's quite small compared to the actual sporophyte generation. These guys are also grouped by if they produce spores, which means they're seedless, or if they use seeds to disperse their species. Vascular seedless plants, so they use the spores to disperse their species. Some examples are club mosses, whisk ferns, horsetails, and just normal ferns. So here's that insert of the phloem and the xylem. So the function of the phloem is to transport nutrients and the food, essentially. So all the sugars and amino acids, they leave down here from the leaves, and they go to the storage of the different organs in the plants. And this substance is moved by what's called translocation. We'll get into that a little bit later, but that's the basics right now. Xylem is responsible for transporting water and mineral from the roots to the tops of the plants. So the phloem, the food, is processed and made inside the leaves. So that's the top of the plant. And then it comes back down throughout the body into the roots. So that's phloem down, xylem up, because water comes from the roots of the plants and it has to go all the way up to the top. Here's a picture down here, just kind of showing, this isn't a woody plant, but it's showing you the epidermis, the cortex, and the pith and the cambium. And inside of this little area, you can see the xylem and phloem. So here's the xylem, and it's going up with the water. The phloem will be going down. Xylem is actually not living tissue anymore. And as we go further into plants, we'll be talking about the different cells and the parts of xylem and phloem. But on to the evolutionary history. So we have phylum Pterophyta. These are the ferns, the pterophytes. The gametophyte generation, N, produces the gametes. Gametophyte, gametes. The structures of the gametophyte generation actually looks like this little heart-shaped plant, this body. So if you look down here at the pictures, this is what the gametophyte generation of this plant looks like. So here's the sporophyte, the dominant generation of the fern, and here's the gametophyte generation. Now looking here at this bottom picture, You can see the Antheridia and the Archegonia. As we know, Antheridia is the male structure, and that's what produces the flagellated sperm. The Archegonia is the female structure, and that's where the ova is produced. And it stays in there to prevent the zygote from drying out once fertilization has occurred. In this plant, or the ferns, the fertilization, and the only way for it to occur is if water is present. So it is water dependent for fertilization. Make sure you remember which of these groups of plants that we're talking about require water for fertilization and which do not. So far, bryophytes and pterophytes are what require water for fertilization. Here's the life cycle of the fern. So diploid, 2N. This is the sporophyte generation, the dominant generation in ferns. It's the same thing here, but it just shows the pictures so you know what's going on. You have fertilization, which creates the zygote, which matures into the sporophyte, which produces spores. So if you actually take fern leaves and you flip them over, you can see these kind of rust-colored dots. That's the sporangia. That's where the spores are going to be produced. Now, under meiosis, inside the sporangia, that's where the spores themselves will be. And because it's meiosis, they split, right? So 2N to 1 to N. So these are the different spores. Now, those spores will grow, germinate, and in this situation, the male and female are on the same gametophyte generation. You have the Antheridia and Archegonia on that same body. And so those spores will germinate and become the gametophyte. And this is what it is. It's this tiny little heart shape at the bottom. And when you see the Archegonia and Antheridia, when fertilization takes place, this body right here, the sporophyte, is what's going to be growing out of the gametophyte generation. So when you look at mature ferns, the sporophyte generation, at the very bottom of the roots is where the gametophyte would, right where it hits the ground, is where it would be. A lot of times it just dies off and it doesn't exist as the sporophyte as an adult. If it's a new one, you might be able to find it, but it's kind of rare. But take a look, maybe you'll find one. The sporophyte generation in ferns produces wind-blown spores. So wind is necessary to take those spores to the different locations. The structures associated with the sporophyte generation of the fern, the pterophytes, is the fiddlehead. Fiddlehead is the young curled up fronds that grow out from the ground. So this is a fiddlehead. And a lot of times you can actually, if you're ever stuck in the woods or it's a delicacy, you can eat fiddleheads and make a little soup out of them. They are quite edible. Frond refers to the leaf that contains the leaflets. So this is the frond of the fern. Sporangia are the sac-like structures where the meiosis occurs and where spores are produced, so what we talked about. So under here, you flip the leaf or the frond over, and you see these yellow structures. That's what we're talking about, the sporangia. Now collectively, we call these sori. So that's the difference there. Here's just a little fiddlehead, the new frond coming up. When it develops, then it will form the sporangia, and underneath will be the sori where the spores will be, and then they will rupture open when the wind comes, and they'll blow the spores to their new destination. So something to note, fern gametophyte generation is actually not nutritionally dependent on the sporophyte generation. It is independent of. It can form on its own. It doesn't need any assistance from the sporophyte. However, the sporophyte at first is in there, but then it can grow on its own from the zygote. It's just there for protection. So they're really not nutritionally dependent on one another. They're independent. Let's talk about some economic importance of the ferns or the pterophytes. They're very decorative. You find them in lots of homes and flower arrangements. They are good for cleaning the air in your home. And then there's a lot of medical uses, especially in the Native American culture from the ferns. So they have a lot of economic importance. Okay, let's talk about gymnosperms. So these are vascular naked seed plants. Gymno literally means naked, and sperms, the seed, so naked seeds. So these are the cone-bearing plants. Some examples are the cycads, ginkgo, like Ginkgo biloba, the nephors, conifers, the pine trees, evergreens. those are gymnosperms. And the phylum that we're going to be focusing on is phylum Coniferophyta. These are the evergreens or the softwood trees. So here's just some examples. This is the ginkgo, here's cycads. These are really crazy things in Namibia. You should check them out. And some of the just normal pine trees there that we are familiar with. So life cycles include heterosporangies, so different types of spores. So this is the different sex generations of the sporophyte generation. So as you see here, you have the female cone and a male cone, or stromboli is what they call them, strobili. So megaspores. These megaspores produce in seed of female cone, okay? So that's the bigger one. These are formed by meiosis, and they have these scales, which we call the parts of the cone. They develop into what's called a megagametophyte in the ovule. So an ova develops into each ovule, and if you ever take a pine cone and you open it up down the scale, there are two little grooves. Those are the two ovules per scale. So there's different sperm that have come in and fertilized the different ova, and that's just where they reside. The microspores are produced in the pollen or the male cone. So these are the microspores, here are the megaspores. Inside the microspore is where pollen is formed. Same process by meiosis, and they develop into the microgametophyte, which is the pollen grain. So the microgametophyte generation is the pollen grain. And these contain two non-flagellated sperm. So you have two sperm in there, and we'll show you a picture of what it looks like. And they're kind of independent of each other. They have different chromosomes. And then those will go and fertilize the two different ova in the cone of the female. Pollination. This is really important to know the difference between pollination and fertilization. We've talked about fertilization. That's the fusion of the two gametes coming together. It's the fusion of the nuclei of the male sperm and the female ova. Pollination is just the transfer of pollen from the male structure to the female structure. In Coniferophytas, it's the pollen of the male cone going to the female cone. Okay, and this is all done by the wind. Seeds, okay, that's a new term here. Seed, it's a mature ovule containing the embryo, which is diploid now. It also has a reserve of food, a seed coat, and just so you guys know, the embryo is immature sporophyte generation. So that's what technically the embryo is. It's the new sporophyte that's going to be coming out. Seeds have the seed coat, the sporophyte generation inside, as well as some type of food reserve. Now, seeds germinates, making that new sporophyte generation. In these guys, or over here, life cycles of conifers, it takes at least 3 years from pollination to fertilization to maturation of a seed. So it takes quite a bit of time, but these guys live a long time, so it works out for them. Okay, so let's talk about vascular enclosed seed plants. So angiosperms, these are the covered seeds or the flower-bearing fruits. Okay, so this is the phylum that we're going to be talking mostly about is phylum Anthophyta. Now there's two classes, if you remember what classes were under the domains, kingdom, phylum, class. Okay, class monocotyledons, okay, and eudicotyledons. So mono means one, eu, as we talked about, means true, di means two. The eudicot and monocot is kind of what we just generally call them. It used to just be called dicot for the eudicots, but they've found a little bit more research has been done, so we just call them eudicots now. So just kind of change the name with science changing. Now, these guys are the most populous, diverse, most successful group in all of plants. So if you are a superhero of the plant world, you're probably an angiosperm. These guys produce flowers, seeds, fruits. They pretty much can be found anywhere on the planet that has plants. These flowers are great to attract pollinators. The fruits aid in the seed dispersal. So these guys are everywhere, and they have been super successful. Now I want you guys in a moment to pause and see if you can just kind of guess and fill this out. I also want you later, when you're reviewing for your exams and finals and such, to come back to this page and see if you can fill in without cheating and looking ahead. So your terms that you're going to use: the peduncle, receptacle, the sepals, some textbooks call it the calyx, the petals, it's also called a corolla. And so that's going to be the general of all flowers will have those. Now depending on certain flowers, some flowers are just female, some flowers are just male, some have both. This specific flower has both, and so you're going to have to find the male flower parts. Collectively it's called the stamen. You have the anther and the filament. The female flower parts is called the pistil collectively, and then you have the carpel, the stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. So see if you can fill those out. So pause. Okay, go. So this is what it looks like. Okay, so let's go review. Or I guess I gotta teach you now. So starting from the bottom, this is the peduncle. So if you are looking at a stem or anything before a flower comes up, there's kind of this little area right after the stem, and when it starts to kind of change in its fleshy color or texture, that's the peduncle. And then it starts to swell. That swell area is the receptacle, and that's where all the petals and everything are going to reside on top of. So right there, connected to the receptacle underneath, is called the sepal. Now a sepal essentially protects the petals before they have bloomed out. And so when you see, most of the times they're kind of green, but sometimes they can actually be the color of the petals, so you have to be kind of careful. But they're the ones that when it's a bud and you kind of just see the green, looks like a green leaf on the outside, that's actually a sepal. Okay, so once you have the sepal, then you're going to have the petals that come out. Now, that whole part, okay, the corolla, all that, that's going to be on every flower. Now let's look at the male part first. That's going to be here in red. So collectively, it's called a stamen. I like to think of men, so stamen, so it's male. Then you have the anther, which is the top. Now I like to think of anther, kind of sounds like antler, and males have antlers and they're on the top. And so that's how I remember it. And then filament, this is how I remember it. I think of, okay, there's a guy, he's an electrician, he fixed the light bulb, and it's a filament in the light bulb. Whatever helps you, it's kind of the long stringy part in the light bulb. However helps you remember. So it's the filament and the anther, collectively they're called the stamen. Now on the female part, collectively it's called the pistil. Now the very top is the stigma. Sometimes it has this little fancy thing, or sometimes it's just a round part. How I remember it's sticky, because that's where the pollen has to come and land. So it's the sticky stigma. And then the style, it's the long part coming down. I think women have styles, it's female. And then you have the ovary, and inside the ovary are the ovules, and the ovules will have the ova. So those together are the pistil. So make sure you test yourself and you know these, because you're going to be asked on quizzes and exams. Alright, back to the seed. So as we know, the angiosperms have seeds and fruit. So let's talk about theirs. So matured ovule contains the embryo, which is diploid. It also has a reserve of food and a seed coat. So it's essentially the same as the gymnosperm. However, there are two different kinds of plants, the monocots and the eudicots, and their seeds differ that way. We'll talk about that in just a second. Fruit is essentially a matured ovary. So your apple that you're biting, it's the ovary, and inside you have the ovule, and eventually it becomes the seeds, right, if it's fertilized. And so they can be fleshy, they can be dry, different nuts and everything like that. Those are dry fruits. And these aid in the dispersal of the species, because some animal comes along, eats it, carries it someplace else, and if it either drops it from its mouth or it drops it from other parts with fertilizer, then it's even better. And so that's how angiosperms, they use pollinators. They can use wind, they can use water. to disperse their species. So they're pretty phenomenal in how they are able to spread across the globe. So let's look at this. This is a fruit. This is a fleshy fruit, I guess. So you have the fruit here, and then you have inside the seed coat that surrounds it, the embryo, which is going to be the future sporophyte as it matures. And then you have something called the endosperm. This is really what makes a difference from the gymnosperm. This is kind of a big deal. When we talk about polar bodies and everything like that, they'll make more sense. But that is essentially the food source for the developing embryo. Now looking over here, this is a monocot seed, and over here is a eudicot seed. Mono meaning one cotyledon, di meaning two cotyledons. Now cotyledons are essentially seed leaves. They're the parts that help protect the seed and the embryo as it starts to develop when it's coming out of the soil. And so it's the first part that goes through, penetrates the soil, makes sure that the actual fragile part of the plant is able to break through and be okay. Monocots only have one cotyledon or one seed leaf. Eudicots have two. So if you look here, this is corn. Corn, you can't split the seed in half or anything. Here, have you ever seen the bean as the two halves? Because it is a dicot. So let's look a little bit about the difference between monocots and eudicots. Some examples of monocots. They're usually the herbaceous plants like corn, all the grasses, lilies, stuff like that. Now their seed, they have one cotyledon, meaning one seed leaf, what we just talked about. Now here's something new, flower petals. If you go out and you can see flowers and you count the flowers, if they are multiples of 3, so 3, 6, 9, so forth, that is a sure sign that it is a monocot. So pretty interesting. Now let's look at eudicots. These guys, they do have some herbaceous and woody, so lima beans, strawberries, dandelions, roses, lots of different types of trees, those kind of things. These have two cotyledons or seed leaves. Now with their flower petal pattern, they're multiples of 4 or 5. So when you're counting them and you have anything that could be divisible by 4 or 5, then you know that it is a eudicot. Now if there's 12, there's other things you need to look at to determine if it's a monocot or a eudicot. And we'll show you how in a little bit later. So the life cycle includes heterosporangy. So let's first talk about the microspores. So microspores produced in the male flower part, which we know is called the stamen. So in here, it's formed by the meiosis actually in the anther. Then it develops into the microgametophyte. So pollen grain is the microgametophyte generation. Now, this contains 2 non-flagellated sperm. So looking in this picture, here's your stamen, the filament, anther. Inside is where you're going to find that microgametophyte or the pollen grain. Over here you have the megaspores. Now these megaspores are produced in the female flower part, known as the carpel. They're formed also by meiosis, but this occurs in the ovary and develops into the megagametophyte in the ovule. And an ova will develop in the ovule of the ovary. Okay, so looking over here, you have the stigma, style, and the ovule, and inside of those are the ovaries on the outside. And then you have the ovule and the ova inside. Now, what you see in this picture is the pollen tube. Pollen tube occurs when the pollen grain will land and it actually produces the structure that will burrow all the way through down the style into where the ovules are, and then goes into the ovule into the ova, and that's how it will fertilize the actual egg. So in plants and in pretty much all animals, the mega is generally referred to the female because they're the ones that are going to be housing the new generation. So they get larger, they have to have more materials in order to make sure that the new offspring has space and resources to grow. So here is a huge difference between any other plant and the angiosperms. It's called double fertilization. So one of the unique things, most amazing things about angiosperms, double fertilization. Hint, hint. So one sperm plus an ova will equal the embryo. So we got that. Now the other sperm, because we talked about how there was two in the pollen grain, instead of just fertilizing another egg, what happens is that the sperm will go down, and once it goes through the pollen tubes, that extra sperm will meet up and join and fuse together what's called polar bodies. Now those will equal what's called the endosperm. Now this is the actual nutrients or the food source for this new developing embryo. So when you have the seed in here, you have the embryo and endosperm. Okay, so that's equals a seed. So you have the pollen grain coming down here. Sorry about the copyright things there. Then the pollen grain comes down, and if you see right here, you have two of those sperm nuclei. Once it comes down and burrows in, then you can see that one sperm fertilizes the central cell, and that's going to be the ova, which will eventually become the zygote and the embryo, that kind of thing. And then the other ends, the polar bodies, so the ends of inside, those are going to be fertilized by the other sperm, but they're not offspring. They're going to be food. And so that's what double fertilization is for. So it takes two sperm to essentially make one seed in angiosperms. Here's just a life cycle here you can see of a sporophyte generation of the angiosperms and the gametophyte generation. As you see here, the pollen grain is the microgametophyte, and the ovule is going to be the megagametophyte. Okay, and so double fertilization will take place. Once that occurs, then you can get your seed. And the seeds, if it's a fruiting body, once that occurs, then the fruit on the outside will grow from the. Once you have the flower will fall off, and then that ovary will swell and become the fruit, and that will be on your mature sporophyte. And so once that occurs, then they'll fall off and disperse the species, and then flowers will come back, and you'll start the next wave of generations being reproduced. So you can look through this diagram. It's, I believe, also in your lab manual. It gives you a little bit more detail exactly what's happening. So I have a few questions. I want you to explain to yourself why gymnosperms produce seeds but not fruits. Yet angiosperms produce seeds with fruit. Why do you think that is? Seeds in gymnosperms are winged. They look like little Mickey Mouse things. I didn't go into too much detail about that. But we know that they're adapted to be dispersed by the wind from the cones. And so they are strictly formed for wind. Angiosperms use the fruit to aid in the seed dispersal, and they use animals. Explain why gymnosperms and angiosperms do not require water for fertilization. Pause. Okay, I figured it out. Because these guys do not have flagellated sperm. They do not require the sperm to actually go and swim someplace. The pollen granules, be it the gymnosperms, which look like Mickey Mouse, or just the pollen grains that kind of have a spiky thing, which a lot of us are allergic to, that pollen is carried by the wind or by bees or by pollinators or whatever else to get to where it needs to be. So pollination occurs both in gymnosperms and angiosperms by the wind. What adaptation allows pollination to be more successful in angiosperms? Now, there's two things that are really big. The stigma of the flower is sticky, and it therefore can actually attach and catch the pollen. Also, the flower can attract pollinators. A lot of them have nectar and sweet substances that draw in the pollinators to come, and once they get dusted with the pollen and they go to another flower to eat the nectar, then that pollen is just going to be dusted off and get stuck on that sticky stigma. The ovary in gymnosperms is actually located in a cone, and that's kind of hard to get to because we have to make sure that it goes all the way in the very back where that's located. With the angiosperms, it's kind of more out in the open, and it has those things with ability to form, well, the stigma and the pollen tube and directly get it to where it needs to be. So it's a little bit more evolved in that sense. Both gymnosperms and angiosperms disperse their species via seeds. What adaptation allows angiosperms to be more successful in seed dispersal? Well, dispersal relies on wind, gravity, water, and or animals. Okay? Now, angiosperms utilize all these forms. So, all other plants, it's either water, or with the gymnosperms, they can use wind and anything else to help them out as well, because they don't have to worry about their flagellated sperm, because they don't have any. The sperm can get where it needs to go by the wind or water or other distribution methods by natural forces of nature. But angiosperms take it a step further and make it so that animals are able to, they kind of use us for their own means. They feed us, and they also get to spread their seeds. Let's quickly talk about economic importance of angiosperms. Food. Oh my gosh. Wheat, corn, rices, all these are types of grasses. All of our cereals, everything like that. Huge. Huge. Sugar production. We have sugar cane, sugar beets, so many spices, our drinks, latex from rubber, sap, fabric. All of our cotton is from a plant. Lumber, obviously we live in houses and build things. There's tons of medical drugs and pharmaceuticals that make it so we can, aspirin, that's something that many of us use or have someone who knows who's taken it. And of course there's the aesthetic value. The greens, the lush things that we have in our house. There's so much when it comes to economic importance with angiosperms. Now here's kind of the overview of what this plant part is talking about. Let's focus on mosses, which we know are the bryophytes. They don't have vascular tissue. The dominant generation is the gametophyte generation. They have spores to disperse their species. Pollen doesn't exist for these guys. They don't have pollen. And fertilization is, in fact, water dependent. The ferns, or the pterophytes, vascular tissue is present. Their dominant generation is the sporophyte. Spores are used to disperse the species. They do not use pollination because they don't have pollen. And water is necessary for fertilization. Gymnosperms. Vascular tissue is present. Dominant generation, sporophyte. Dispersal of seeds. Okay, this are the naked seeds because they don't have fruit. So that's literally what it means, naked seeds. So pollination occurs by the wind, gravity, water, but it doesn't utilize animals, right? That's later. And then water is independent when it comes, well, fertilization does not require water. It's independent. Angiosperms. Vascular tissue is present. Sporophyte generation, dominant. Covered seeds. These guys have fruit, that added extra swelling of the ovary to make it more enticing for animals to disperse the species, which is involved in pollination, which they can use wind, gravity, water, and animals. And fertilization is also independent of water. And I put pollinators there because some plants are actually very specific and they require pollinators to come to bring the pollen to the right spot. Technically, fertilization is only when fusion of the nuclei occur between the sperm and the ova, just to make sure you guys are aware of that. Okay, well, hopefully this also was helpful, and we'll talk to you guys in another video later.